Chapter 10. Once again, the elite of Kenyatta's group were gathered in the black leader's apartment. Duke Sims, Amos Cortner, Mike Allen, and Stonewall Manfred sat on a large couch, sipping their drinks quietly. Elliot Stone and Kenyatta stood at the bar, with Rufus and Edgar seated on dining room chairs against the wall. In the center of the room was Wilbert Chamus, a shaken and broken man who was bartering for his life. For over 10 hours, Kenyatta had been with the man, attempting to break him down. It had taken a little heavy-handed work to convince the former kingpin that his glory days were over. But after a few raps against the side of the face, struck by Elliot Stone in such a manner as to leave no traces, Chamus had finally agreed to call his man outside the city. The phone call had been made, and Chamus had told his connect that he had a source of heroin unequaled in the country. The connect had taken Chamus's phone number and told him to wait for his return call. That had been 2 hours ago, and the men had waited during that time for the response. "Now remember, Chamus," Kenyatta said coldly, "when he calls, you tell him like I told you." Chamus nodded. "Yeah," he began, his voice weak with terror and fatigue. "You won't deal with anyone but the big man. I'll tell him." "You'd f***ing better, my man," Kenyatta said. "Or else your motherfucking life ain't worth a piece of shit. You dig what the f*** I'm coming from?" Yeah, I dig it." Chamus stared straight ahead, his eyes following the pattern on the rug in small circles. He had been confronted with that onslaught of Kenyatta throughout the long and bloody day. At 10 minutes to 9, the phone rang. Kenyatta picked up the receiver and handed it to Chamus. The look in the black man's eyes was enough to frighten any man. It practically turned Chamus speechless. Wilbert Chamus spoke for 10 minutes, mostly nodding his head and answering with short, "Yes." The conversation finished. He hung up the phone and turned to Kenyatta. "He'll meet us," Chamus said softly. "Where?" Kenyatta asked quickly. "In the desert, out of town, near Barstow." At least, Kenyatta thought, they were moving out of the ghetto and closer to some of the big action. Barstow could only mean one thing: Las Vegas. And coming out of that town meant the organization, the brotherhood, the mafia, or whatever one chose to call it. "Okay, when is it set?" Chamus asked for a cigarette before replying. "Tomorrow night, 9 o'clock. The old Hanson Ranch, just outside of town." "Will he be alone?" Stone asked, speaking for the first time. Chamus looked warily at the man he had ordered killed. The sight of Elliot Stone still alive had sent cold chills down the man's spine. It was an omen, an indication to Chamus that his end had come. He knew now that he would be fortunate just to survive what lay ahead. "I said my man!" Stone exclaimed. "Will he be alone?" Chamus nodded. "He knows the stuff is all right, 'cause I told him it was. He wants you to bring it yourself, all of it." Kenyatta chuckled. "Sure, man. Now why don't you go into the other apartment with Rufus and Edgar here and get yourself some sleep?" Chamus struggled to his feet, with Edgar and Rufus on either side. Each man grabbed an arm and led Chamus from the living room. Kenyatta called out to his 2 men and tossed them a fifth of Jack Daniels. Rufus caught the bottle and grinned back at his man. "Thanks, my man. Gonna be a long f***ing night." Kenyatta walked around behind the bar and rested his elbows on the fine mahogany. Well, I don't really know. I'm going out there tomorrow night with Elliot here right beside me and a backup car on the road. Aside from that, I can't tell nothing till we know who it is that we're meeting with. I could dig that, Ken, Stonewall said. But we're getting pretty fucking close to the main supplier, ain't we? I mean, shouldn't we lay down some kind of precautions? Kenyatta stroked his bald pate for a moment before replying, "You're right, my man. I was thinking that each of you should get your people together and prepare them for traveling. Get your cars filled with gas. Get your rods together. All the shit you need." "Is that it, man?" Sims asked. "Yeah. Just be ready for a phone call from me. I'll call you dudes at Stonewall's place." "Where do you think it'll be coming down, Ken?" Sims asked. Kenyatta took a long sip from his drink, then placed the glass gently on the counter. He looked to Stone. "Where do you think, Elliot?" Stone did not hesitate. "Las Vegas. The way things are looking, the man's bringing the stuff in by car. It's the dude we saw those times out front of Chamus's place. No doubt that the pickup was close by. Now, with the desert scene happening out there in Barstow, I will lay odds it was Vegas." "That's about the way I see it too," Kenyatta added. "And that's where I hope we finally get. I mean, if this dude's willing to come out all the way to Barstow, then we'll hit him there if we can. If not, we'll get him in Vegas. But we got to be sure first." The four men on the couch stood up and made ready to depart. "Listen, Kenyatta," Sims said. "If you need a damn army, we'll have one waiting for you, you dig?" Kenyatta smiled and grasped Sims's hand. "Yeah, dude, I dig where you're coming from. Let's get it moving. You're gonna hear from me tomorrow night." The men shook hands all around, and finally, only Stone and Kenyatta were left in the living room. Kenyatta poured another round of drinks, and the two men drank in silence. "You know something, Elliot?" Kenyatta began after refilling the glasses. "After all the shit I've been through, I began to think that finally it's going to pay off." "I see where you're coming from," Stone replied. "Yeah," Kenyatta continued, his voice softer now. "There was nothing as big as this shit going down in Detroit. I mean, seemed like all we hassled with were a bunch of street pushers and fucked up junkies. But this scene, well, this is something different." Stone nodded. "You think we'll be able to pull it off?" "Shit, man," Kenyatta exclaimed. "Man like me waits all his fucking life to pull something like this off. And he knows he's got to. Ain't no two ways about it, my man." Stone laughed and Kenyatta joined him. Both men knew within 24 hours they were going up against men who would just as soon kill a man as look at him. They also knew they were going up against men, possibly white men, who had the law on their side. They were the controlling powers, the fatsy who sat back in their leather office chairs, dealing out death and corruption with one flick of their pudgy pink fingers. These were the men whom Kenyatta had always been after, yet men whom he had never really seen. The possibility that finally he would be meeting them face to face was an invigorating thought. Kenyatta and Stone drank in silence. Both men thought about the events of that day and what would be the events of the upcoming days. In their own separate ways, they were both grateful that Chamus had hit the OEO house when he had. Finally, Kenyatta put his drink down and stood erect. "Man, I got me a beautiful woman waiting in the bedroom there." "Ain't no better way to relieve tension, Ken," Stone said with a grin, realizing how much he himself needed a woman right then. Kenyatta smiled. "I'll see you later, my man. You just make yourself comfortable, dig?" Elliot Stone nodded and watched Kenyatta as the big man strode across the living room and into the bedroom. The room was dark, but the outline of Betty's naked figure beneath the sheets was visible as some light poured in through the window outside. Kenyatta stood above the bed and stared down at her brown flesh, her slightly parted lips, and her smooth, high forehead. "Hey, you awake?" he asked in a whisper. Betty stretched out, pulling her arms above her head. The sheet fell below her large, serious wombs, revealing her silver dollars. As she opened her eyes and saw Kenyatta getting undressed above her, her nipples began to pucker. Soon the carrier's best. "Baby," Kenyatta said as he crawled into bed next to his woman. Betty stretched her long, lean legs out and threw one over Kenyatta's hip. Seductively, she pushed her silver against him. Kenyatta smiled and pulled the woman to him. He drew her mouth against his, and their tongues clashed in a practiced rhythm of moist contact. "Oh, baby," Kenyatta moaned as he rolled over and lifted himself. Betty raised her hips off the bed, then reached down and guided him.
Take me, Ken, please,"
Betty cried as Kenyatta drove smoothly and gently. Kenyatta lit a cigarette for both of them after they had finished. He felt deliciously drained, as though all the tension and fatigue of the day had been sucked out of him in one beautiful surge. Betty lay on her back next to him, still trembling from her scam.
"Ken?"
Betty began softly. "Yeah, babe."
"I'm frightened, Ken. I'm scared about what's happening with Chamus."
Kenyatta chuckled. She had been through some horrible things with him, and every time she had voiced the same kind of fear. Yes, Kenyatta thought, I would have been worried if she hadn't said anything.
"I mean it, Ken.
Betty insisted.
I'm frightened of this whole thing. I mean, you don't really know what you're getting into, do you?"
"Listen, honey," Kenyatta replied. "I've gone into things before that I didn't know about. This ain't nothing new. And besides, it's worth it, ain't it?"
"Yes, I suppose."
Betty fell into a deep silence. They lay in bed smoking cigarettes, with the only sound being that of their breath as they exhaled. After a while, Kenyatta felt the bed shaking slightly, and he knew that Betty was crying. He reached across to her and took her hand and held it against his chest. They slept like that until morning, when Stone knocked loudly on the door to awaken them. At 10 o'clock in the morning, after a huge breakfast fixed by Betty, Kenyatta was ready to leave. He, Stone, and Chamus would ride in the Cadillac, with Rufus and Edgar trailing behind in the Chevrolet. Elliot Stone sat on the couch, cleaning his .45 and checking the trigger action. Chamus, having been brought into the room by Edgar and Rufus, sat in the same chair in the center of the room. His hands were tied behind his back. He sported a new suit and otherwise looked like the Chamus of old. Kenyatta entered the room wearing a leather jacket and a tight-fitting turtleneck. He glanced about, patted the inside of his coat to make sure the .38 was in place, and then walked over to where Chamus was sitting. "You ready to meet your friend, Chamus?" Wilbert Chamus sat with his head down on a chair. What had once been a totally arrogant stature had degenerated into a humble, almost pathetic stance. Kenyatta grabbed the lapel of Chamus's coat and hoisted the man to his feet. "Okay, dude, you're riding with us." Then turning to Rufus, he asked, "Got the wheels ready?"
"Both are waiting downstairs, Ken,"
Rufus replied. All right, then. Let's split. Kenyatta led the way, pushing Chamus in front of him, while Rufus, Edgar, and Elliot followed behind. The street was empty for a Friday morning. A few cars glided by, but the usual business traffic was not present. The Cadillac and the green Chevrolet waited, parked next to each other. Kenyatta went straight to the caddy, opened the rear door, and shoved Chamus inside. Okay, he said to Rufus and Edgar. We get split up. Meet us in the Denny's in Barstow. The two men nodded and climbed into the Chevrolet. Elliot Stone got behind the steering wheel, checked the automatic locks on the door in the rear, then started up the car. Kenyatta climbed in next to him, pulled out his .38, and laid the pistol down on the seat between them. Just in case our friend back there tries anything, he said. Stone smiled back, then pulled away from the curb. They took the freeways out of Los Angeles, through the San Fernando Valley, and out into the San Gabriel Mountains. In another hour, they passed through Lancaster, the first town in the Mojave Desert, and followed the freeway toward the town of Mojave. The heroin had been stashed in the lining of the ceiling, in case it was stopped by the highway patrol. Nevertheless, Kenyatta began to grow uptight about Stone's excessive speed. Hey man, just fucking cool it. I'm getting a fucking jet lag. Stone laughed and eased up on the accelerator. It felt good to be driving the powerful car out in the open expanse of the desert. The air was clear, no smog, and the sun was bright and direct. The highway was flat and built for speed. Rufus and Edgar followed close behind in the green Chevrolet, keeping pace with the Cadillac. Each time Stone looked in the rearview mirror, he could see the two men speaking animatedly with each other, gesturing and laughing. They passed Boren, a mining town, and headed into the last stretch of desert before Barstow. Since leaving Los Angeles, Chamus had not spoken a word. He sat in the seat with his head bent forward. Finally, Kenyatta became upset with the man's silence. Hey man, he began harshly. You better start talking a little before you forget how. Chamus glanced up, nodding as though coming out of a stupor. He stared blankly at Kenyatta. Tell me you're doing fine, nigger, Kenyatta ordered, lifting the pistol above the seat so that Chamus could see it.
I'm doing fine,
Chamus mumbled. That's better, motherfucker, Kenyatta said, then turned back to watch the road ahead. Stone glanced at the big black man next to him and felt a tinge of worry creep through his gut. He had never known Kenyatta to be so edgy, so willing to put a man down like he had just done with Chamus. He wondered if, for the first time in his life, Kenyatta was actually afraid. You okay? Stone asked. Kenyatta nodded. Sure, man. No reason not to be. But there was still something in Kenyatta's voice that Stone did not like. A tone that did not express the strength and courage the man usually had. When the small caravan reached Barstow, Chamus directed Stone towards the outskirts of town. They passed through the small city, then turned onto a 2-lane road heading north into the desert. Within 5 minutes, they were in the middle of nowhere. They drove for another 5 miles before reaching an old battered sign that read, Hanson Ranch. That's it, Kenyatta said, pointing out the sign.
Yeah,
Chamus said. It is f***ing desolate out here, Kenyatta exclaimed, as Stone slowed down the car and pulled to the side of the road. Is this where we're meeting tonight? Stone asked. Chamus nodded.
500 yards after the sign, that's what he said.
Rufus and Edgar pulled up behind the Cadillac and stopped. Both men hopped out of the car and came up on either side. "This is it," Stone said to Rufus. Rufus looked around at the desolation and frowned. Up ahead, there was a small rise in the road, but other than that, everything was flat and empty. "Man, this is some perfect place for bird dogging." "No-ish," Stone agreed. "Talk about your wide open spaces." Kenyatta had gotten out of the car and was scanning the area. Finally, he moved to the front of the car and spoke to Rufus and Edgar. "Tonight, I want you dudes up on the hill. You dig where I'm coming from?" "Yeah," Rufus answered for the both of them. "And I want you facing down this way, ready to flash your lights on if we need it. Up there, you'll be able to hear and see everything that's coming down. Dig?" Rufus and Edgar both nodded. In the back seat of their cars were 2 shotguns, 2 high-powered rifles, and 3 .38 pistols. They were ready for whatever might come down that night. "Okay," Kenyatta said finally. "Let's move back to town and get something to eat." The Motel 6 in Barstow was a large rectangular building with half the rooms facing a parking lot in the rear. Stone had rented one of these rooms, and the rest of the group were able to climb the stairs and enter it without being seen. Inside the small cubicle, the entourage lounged away the afternoon, eating the fried chicken they had ordered and watching television. Each man, silent in his own thoughts, was preparing himself for what the night might bring. The only exception was Wilbert Chamus, who knew deep down inside that, no matter what he did, he would soon be a dead man. His desperate thinking, his ordeal of attempting to discover a way out, had left him drained and exhausted. He slept soundly throughout the afternoon on the small lounge chair in the motel room. Over 150 miles northeast of Barstow, Clement Jenkins stood on the 12th floor of the Sands Hotel. The white-haired man, now in his late 60s, gazed out the huge picture window of his penthouse suite. Beneath him were the buildings, the casinos, the hotels, and the multitudes of people swarming the Las Vegas Strip. Beyond them was the clear, distant desert.
"Well?"
Oscar Manning asked. Jenkins turned slowly to his prime heroin runner and stroked his small mustache thoughtfully.
"Oscar, I think we should take a stab. The man is obviously intent on moving his stuff, and if he's black, he's going to sell at a very low price."
Oscar Manning, a white man in his early 50s, a former real estate broker who had finally discovered where the big money was, just nodded. He had come a long way in his 50 years, but nothing compared to Clement Jenkins. Clement Jenkins had inherited over $500,000 and a small light bulb factory from his father. Jenkins had been 29 at the time and broke. With the gift, he began manufacturing Christmas tree lights, then outdoor lights, and finally cornered the market on fluorescent lights. After that, it was all gravy. But Clement Jenkins was one of those men to whom wealth was immaterial. It was the making of the money that counted, the continual process of gaining more and more, stockpiling it until there was nothing left to do but count it. Thus, Jenkins had begun importing rare and exotic narcotics. 20 years ago, he had begun with hashish. During the 50s, he had graduated to cocaine. When the 60s arrived, he had financed a young chemist in San Francisco to produce huge amounts of LSD. Then finally, Clement Jenkins had begun selling, importing, and dealing in heroin. Of course, one of Jenkins's motivations for this line of business was personal. Clement Jenkins had been a heroin addict for the past 10 years. But sitting atop the sands in his privately owned suite, Clement Jenkins was considered by everyone to be the most upright, honorable citizen in Las Vegas. He supplied jobs for thousands of people with his casinos and nightclubs, and his effect on local politics was powerful and certain. For Oscar Manning, Clement Jenkins was the top man, a man who made it himself. Thus, it was with hesitation that Manning asked his boss the next question.
Are you sure it's worth dealing with a black?
Jenkins looked at Manning, then sat down slowly in his leather chair.
Oscar, there are some things better left to certain people. The French and Italians for many years have been supplying us with top-grade stuff, but the political pressures raise the prices and the smugglers hesitate to take the chances without sufficient compensation. With blacks, it's different. They'll take the chances because they don't have a future anyway. They dislike themselves so much through conditioning that they'll submit to the most lucrative deals. In other words, Oscar, they are the easiest race of people in the world to give the shaft to.
Manning laughed.
Yeah, Clement, I can see your point. Yes, Oscar, Jenkins mused. I think we will deal with this man. After all, a pound of heroin is a pound of heroin, and a black is a black.
Manning watched his man as he spun around in his chair and returned to his panoramic view of the desert town of Las Vegas. At precisely 9 o'clock that night, Oscar Manning, along with 2 armed bodyguards, pulled to a stop on the Hanson Road 500 yards beyond the sign. The night was bright around them. The stars glistened and the desert was quiet. 5 minutes later, Kenyatta's Cadillac pulled up alongside Manning's limousine. Chamus climbed out of the back seat and Kenyatta emerged from the front. Manning climbed out of the back of the limousine and confronted both Kenyatta and Chamus in the small space between the cars. The huge size of the bald-headed black man shook Manning, and he found himself backing away even before the men began speaking.
It's all right, man,
Chamus said, his voice shaky and uncertain. Listen, man, Kenyatta said quickly. I'm here to deal, that's all. Manning looked past Kenyatta and into the Cadillac. All he saw was Elliot Stone. He looked fairly harmless.
Okay,
Manning said.
Talk.
You know what's happening, man. You know what I got. I want the bread in cash. Half deposited at a bank in Algiers, half in cash. Payment upon delivery, you dig?
Yes, I understand,
Manning replied.
700,000?
800,000, Kenyatta replied quickly.
775, that's the limit.
The men stood silent for a moment. Kenyatta shrugged his shoulders. Just a minute, man. I gotta speak with my partner. Kenyatta turned away from the men and leaned into the car. He knew it was safe because Rufus and Edgar had their high-powered rifles trained on the 2 men. Chamus would not dare to make a move. What do you think, Elliot? Kenyatta asked. Stone leaned across the seat so that he could be heard. In a whisper, he said, The dude is Oscar Manning, the runner. We had the both of them get in the pictures, Kenyatta. Kenyatta smiled at Stone. Thanks, man. Chamus and Manning waited between the cars with Manning attempted to make pleasant conversation with the former big wheel from Watts. Kenyatta stepped between the 2 men and spoke to them both at the same time. I dug it, Kenyatta began in his coldest voice, that you were taking me to the fucking top, Chamus, and not to some white runner. You dig where the I'm coming from? Manning could feel the cold sweat forming quickly on his body as Kenyatta spoke. As a reflexive action, he turned back to the men sitting in his car. Kenyatta grabbed the white man's shoulder and spun him around. I wouldn't do that, man, Kenyatta warned. I got two high-powered motherfuckers sitting on that hill up there ready to blow your motherfucking brains out. Okay, Manning begged. Please. Kenyatta laughed sardonically, then released his grip. Okay then, he began. You take me to the man and no one else, and I'll deal.
But we never...
Manning began. You never what? Bullshit. This is a new fucking day, Jack, and if you want what I got, we deal with the man. You dig? Manning shrugged.
I'll call him.
You do that, Kenyatta shouted. Manning got into the back seat of his limousine and picked up the phone. He explained the situation. Then he listened. Finally, he hung up the phone.
He wants to see me before he deals with you,
Manning explained weakly. Kenyatta thought quickly. He could keep Manning under the barrel of his gun, but that would set off the big man. The closest he would ever get to the source would then be one of his flunkies. He would have to take the chance with Manning and hope that the man was as greedy as he thought he was. It was his only chance to get to the top. Okay, give me the number to call. Manning reached into his pocket and pulled out a card. Kenyatta took the card and guessed at the prefix on the phone number. Vegas, huh? Manning nodded.
That's right. Call him tonight.
Kenyatta nodded. Manning got into the back seat of the car and told his driver to take him back. All the while, Chamus was trying to tell Manning something, staring at him intently with begging eyes. But in the darkness of the desert night, the black man's attempt failed. In the car, Chamus, Kenyatta ordered. Chamus jumped into the back seat and Kenyatta got into the front. Drive, Elliot. We got to get to a phone booth. Stonewall and the others shouldn't be more than 2 hours behind us if we get them driving right now. Elliot Stone flashed his headlights twice to signal Rufus and Edgar, then spun the car around and headed back to Barstow. His adrenaline was flowing like crazy. This time around, he could sense that they were really onto something worthwhile. Man, he exclaimed to Kenyatta, I'm beginning to enjoy this ish. I can dig it, Kenyatta replied softly. I can dig it.